Good evening. Great to be learning with you on a Tuesday. Let's light up the darkness. Maybe we should start saying the days of the week in Hebrew. I've had to learn them because there's always the Yom toward the end of the prayer service in the morning, and then we say a Kaddish after that. So it's Tuesday is Yom Shlishi, the third day of the week. Sunday's Yom Rishon, day 1. Monday is Yom Sheni, day 2. Yom Shlishi is Tuesday. Wednesday's Yom Revi'i, day 4. Thursday is Yom Hamishi, day 5. Friday, the 6th day of the week, getting close to Shabbos, that's Yom Shishi. And then it's not Yom Shevi, it's Shabbos. So how's everybody doing? Great to be with you on Yom Shlishi. Just about to become, well, now the time changed. So I'll be going to afternoon service right after class. And then the day will change over between that and the Ma'ariv, the night service. Okay, who's with us? Yehud in South Carolina, Paula in Chicago, Stephen in New Hampshire, other Paul in the Great Northwest, Shandor in the Bronx, Lucina, Minnesota, Bella in Florida, Bill in mid-Missouri. He got his new glasses and shocked to see everything so clear. Always a good feeling. I love getting new glasses in terms of now I can see again. Christmas Victory saying shalom from Torah. Karen in Northern California. Sharon in New Jersey. Sam in Virginia. Margaret saying howdy from Katie Hockley. Steve in the UK. Must be very late over there or early. Joe in the Inland Empire. Peggy in Colorado. Ooh, I gotta reload the YouTube. There it is. And over there, Ella checking in and saying shalom. Welcome, everybody. Today's episode of AT Daily is sponsored by Susan Golbin in honor of my Musser Vad and facilitator, Helene Scheiss. What a beautiful dedication to Helene. And Susan, thank you for enabling us to share more Torah with more people around the world. May you and all your loved ones and Helene be showered in blessings. We say amen. If you'd like to sponsor an episode of AT Daily, donate.accidentaltalmudist.org. Okay, let's get to it. Our daf today is daf Nun, page 50, here in Tractate Nazir, the 17th volume of the Talmud. We are in chapter 7, continuing our discussion of Mishnah number 2. We're sort of getting into some of the nitty-gritty basics. So that we know that the Nazir is not permitted to become impure for the dead. And if he does, he has to bring offerings, the offerings of impurity, only possible when the temple is standing. It's one of the many reasons we don't take a vow of Naziris anymore. The temple hasn't been standing in almost 2,000 years. Now, he doesn't become impure for the dead, or she doesn't become impure for the dead. But what counts as becoming impure for the dead? So we've talked about you don't enter a cemetery, you don't touch a human corpse, you don't assist in a burial. But now the sages, really get down to brass tacks, tachlis as they say, what counts as a corpse. Obviously, an entire human body counts as a corpse. If the dead person is right before you. But what if a dead person died in a location, a long time ago and wasn't buried and the corpse is found still there? I think I just read in the news that a man disappeared and then his wife found the body in a closet of a very, like a hoarder type of house months later. I mean, how horrific for the family. But at any rate, is that still considered a corpse? What if it's, many years along and it's really, desiccated and fallen apart and the corpse has turned into dust? Does that still count as a corpse? And is there a difference between what triggers bringing the offerings of impurity and what triggers shaving, right? So a Nazir is not allowed to shave or remove hair during the days of his Nazirs. But if he becomes impure for the dead, then yes, he has to restart his count of days, and he has to shave his head in order at the same time that he does that. So there's like, as we'll see in the next Mishnah, there's a level of, sort of minimum volume of a corpse or corpse-like substance that could trigger bringing the offerings of impurity, but perhaps not trigger shaving, and vice versa. So we're getting into these kinds of nuances. Here we are on page 50a, a few paragraphs from the top. The Mishnah taught that a Nazir shaves for impurity, meaning shaves his head, because he was a Nazir when he became impure for the dead, and he shaves for impurity imparted not only by a corpse, but by an olive bulk of a corpse. So just a tiny piece of a corpse amounting to the volume of an olive, and for impurity imparted by an olive bulk of fluid. So what do we mean when we say fluid? And the Gemara explains, and what is fluid? This is referring to flesh of the corpse that liquefied and subsequently congealed, and liquid from the corpse that began to boil and then hardened. And the Gemara, and this is not referring to blood, right? It's that the actual flesh somehow became liquefied. This sounds really just horrifically gross, and we don't even want to think about it, but the sages will always, test those liminal areas of the law to understand, well, exactly, how far does this law extend and where does it stop? It's not that these cases are so common, but that's where the interesting debates of law are. And I'll say that I was once working in the public defender's office as an intern way back when I was in college, between junior and senior year of college. I worked in the public defender's office in Washington, D.C., and our job as interns was to take statements from witnesses and sometimes from the defendant. Well, not from the defendant, but from the from witnesses and from witnesses. And it was an unpaid job, so they tried to make the that summer that we spent there a little bit more interesting and educational. And we got some special privileges like riding along in a police car during a shift, visiting a prison, and a visit to the coroner's office. And I recall that this was the summer in Washington, D.C., which is hot and humid. And a corpse that was in the coroner's office that day it was a murder victim, and had been left in the trunk of a car for a week or more than a week. And so, as you can imagine, the smell was, many years later, I still recoil at the memory of that smell. And there was definitely this idea that the corpse had really putrefied, and I'm sure that some parts of that flesh probably did liquefy in a trunk that heated up to 120 degrees in the humidity of Washington. Sorry to share that with you. We'll move on. Okay, so the Gemara asks, what are the circumstances in which the congealment, this liquid that oozed from a corpse and then congealed, what are the circumstances when the congealment is a determinative factor in the imparting of impurity? If a Nazir came into contact, if we say that we do not know that the substance with which the Nazir came into contact, that it is from a corpse, well then, even if it congealed, what of it? Rather, you will say that we know that this liquid came from the corpse. But then the Nazir should be impure whether or not it congealed, right? We know that an olive bulk of liquid that came from a corpse imparts corpse impurity. What difference does it make if it was a liquid that then congealed? So Rabbi Yirmiyah said that this is referring to an unspecified substance that is definitely from the corpse, but is not necessarily a substance that imparts impurity. Meaning, the corpse and any flesh that liquefied, that imparts impurity. But if there was spittle, for example, or urine from the corpse. You know, liquids that might have come out of the corpse, but those are not considered part of the corpse, right? Those would be liquids that, or phlegm for that matter. Those are liquids that were produced while the person was alive, and they are not considered dead in the sense of imparting tuma, imparting ritual impurity. So if we're not sure whether this is, you know, liquid of, you know, corpse flesh that liquefied, or, you know, kind of like the secretions of the person before they died, does this impart impurity or not? Right? So if the substance eventually congeals, well, then it is liquid from the corpse, which imparts impurity. And if it does not congeal, perhaps it is his phlegm and his spittle, which do not impart impurity. Now, with regard to the impurity of fluids from a corpse, Abaye raised a dilemma before Rabbah. Is there the category of fluid with regard to animals, or is there no category of fluid with regard to animals? Now, an animal carcass, right, a dead animal, does not impart corpse tuma. Corpse tuma, this kind of very, very significant tuma that requires a 7-day purification with the waters of sprinkling on the 3rd and 7th day, etc., that's only corpse of a human, right? An animal carcass does impart tuma, but not nearly as strong, right? That ritual impurity, the purification is much quicker, and it doesn't require the waters of sprinkling that contain the ashes of the red heifer. So there is still a kind of impurity, but it's of a much lower degree. They're asking, however, does this concept of fluid from the corpse, do we also have that same concept for animals, fluid from the carcass? Even though it's a lower level of impurity, do we still have the same concept? Is there the category of fluid with regard to animals, or is there no category of fluid with regard to animals? In other words, does fluid from an animal carcass impart impurity like the animal carcass itself, or not? And the Gemara explains the two sides of the dilemma. Do we say that it is learned as a tradition that fluid that comes from a person is impure, but fluid that comes from an animal is not impure? Perhaps, you know, flesh of an animal carcass that liquefied at that point has lost its identity as flesh of an animal carcass, and it actually doesn't impart impurity at all, because already with an animal carcass we're talking about a lower degree of impurity. So maybe this kind of derivative substance from the carcass doesn't impart impurity at all. Or perhaps it is no different as fluid from a human corpse, and likewise fluid from an animal corpse is considered like the flesh itself. So the Gemara comments, well, this works out well. I don't mean when they say this works out well, they're talking about one side or the other of this, it is like a human corpse or it is not like a human corpse. Let's see what they're saying. This works out well according to the one who says that a carcass imparts impurity by a severe impurity through contact and through carrying. Even if you're not in contact with the actual, like with a human corpse, if you touch it, it imparts impurity. Even if you don't actually touch that flesh, but you cause it to be lifted, right? Even if it's wrapped up, but you lift it, like for example, the pallbearers at a funeral, they are definitely going to contract ritual impurity because they are lifting the human body, even though they are not touching it. Stop that. Sorry. There. Right, so where am I? So this works out well according to the one who says that a carcass imparts impurity by a severe impurity, both through contact and carrying, only until the carcass becomes inedible for a stranger. Okay, now when we're talking about an animal carcass, I've got it on. Sorry, I don't know what's going on. I don't know why it's doing that. Sorry. Okay. So if we're talking about a kosher animal, even if it is a kosher animal, for example, right? Let's say a sheep. A sheep is a kosher animal. Jews are allowed to eat mutton, right? But the sheep has to be slaughtered in a kosher manner. It has to be shechted. Right? So that's going to be one smooth cut. There are many, many regulations and rules of kosher slaughter. but it has to be killed by, let's just say, by a kosher slaughter, a shochet, who's going to observe all those laws. If the sheep dies by some other means, if it's slaughtered in a factory with a prod to the head, if it's shot by a hunter with an arrow or with a gun, any other form of slaughter than kosher slaughter, even though it's a kosher animal, is going to render that sheep inedible for a Jew. But it is, of course, the animal shouldn't go to waste, right? And a non-Jew is free to eat that. They're not bound by the laws of kashrut, of kosher. And so therefore you can give this nevela, this animal carcass, even if you own it, you can give it to a non-Jew and they can enjoy it. Now, when it's inedible, and there are going to be two levels of that. First of all, inedible by a non-Jew, and then inedible even by a dog, right? So, it's inedible for a Jew if it just isn't slaughtered in a kosher manner. It becomes inedible for a dog when it has fully putrefied. And those statuses are going to affect what kind of impurity that carcass imparts if you come into contact with it or if you carry it, etc. So let's see what they say here. So this works out well according to the one who says that a carcass imparts impurity by a severe impurity, meaning through contact and carrying, but only until the carcass becomes inedible for a stranger, right? So that a human will not eat it. I.e., in order to impart impurity, it must be fit for human consumption, right? So a Jew may not eat it because it wasn't kosher slaughtered, but a non-Jew can eat it. Once a non-Jew, once no human will eat it because the meat has degraded, so at that point, it's not going to impart impurity through carrying, according to this opinion. And the carcass imparts impurity by a light impurity that imparts impurity on food through contact, right? No more carrying, but it will still impart impurity through actual contact with the carcass as long as it's edible for a dog. Once it has putrefied so much, decomposed so much that even a dog won't eat it, so then it doesn't impart impurity at all. It's no longer associated with death. It's sort of like just gone beyond that. It has rotted, and the animal carcass will not impart impurity. Now, as opposed to a human corpse, even when it has decomposed quite a bit, it will still impart impurity. In fact, corpse impurity, heavy impurity. Now, according to this opinion, it is well, as the law of fluids certainly does not apply to an animal, since meat that has liquefied is no longer fit for human consumption. However, according to the one who says that a carcass imparts impurity by a severe impurity until it becomes inedible for a dog, what is there to say? Since fluids from an animal carcass are presumably fit to be eaten by a dog, the above dilemma as to whether it is pure, whether it is impure, remains pertinent. So the Gemara answers, come in here a resolution from the Tosefta at Zavim 5:9. Excuse me. The fat of an animal carcass that someone liquefied in fire is still impure. However, if it melted in the sun, which ruins the taste, then it is pure. Pure meaning it no longer imparts impurity. Right? It shows you for sure, like when we try to equate tahara, purity, and tuma, impurity, with cleanliness and uncleanliness, we're wrong. That's a false comparison, right? Because here you're learning that meat from an animal, the flesh of an animal that has completely putrefied is pure, whereas when it, is only partially putrefied, it is impure. Why is that? Because it's not about whether it's clean or dirty, whether it has disease or not. This is all about its ability to impart tuma, to impart ritual impurity. And once it has gone beyond the state where even a dog won't eat it, at that point, it's not considered the flesh of an animal anymore, and that's why it doesn't impart impurity. So if the flesh melted in the sun, which ruins its taste, then it is pure. And if it enters your mind that according to the opinion that a carcass imparts impurity until it becomes inedible for a dog, the impurity of fluids does apply to an animal carcass. So if so, even fat that dissolved in the sun should also be impure. Even if its taste is spoiled, it remains edible for a dog. And the Gemara answers, when does this fat liquefy? After it has putrefied, which is why it was thrown out, at which point it melted in the sun. However, once it putrefied, it had already become like dust and lost any status of ritual impurity that it once had. Once it had melted, it is no longer edible for a dog. Consequently, this source provides no proof on the question of whether we consider, flesh of an animal that liquefied, that it will continue to impart impurity the way flesh of a human corpse that liquefied imparts impurity. From the corpse, the human corpse is a much stronger impurity, but the question is, does liquid of an animal carcass, liquefied animal carcass, impart its version of impurity? Now, the Gemara discusses a related issue. We learned in a Mishna, anything that is poured remains ritually pure. In other words, if one pours liquid from one vessel into another, the stream of liquid is not considered to connect the two vessels. Consequently, if the upper vessel and its contents are pure, they do not become impure, even if the lower vessel into which the liquid is poured is impure. The stream of liquid does not link them in this manner. You can get that mental picture. Right. So if you're pouring liquid from one vessel to another, and right now there's a stream of liquid connecting the two vessels. But we're not going to say that if this vessel is impure and this vessel is pure, that the act of pouring liquid from one to the other makes a kind of liquid bridge between the two vessels, so that if this one were impure, now the act of pouring into it would render the upper vessel, which was ritually pure, that it would render it impure. We don't hold by that, right? I was reminded when I was reading this of, the old, is it an urban myth or not, right? That if a person pees on the third rail of a subway track, right, where the electrified third rail, that the person could become electrocuted. Like, we've heard that, and it's like, is it a myth or not? And I actually just looked it up, and Mythbusters, that TV show, actually researched this question and set up a proof, and in fact, it does not work, right? I don't think we should go testing it, but there have been cases of people who were, who died and were electrocuted, when they were peeing on the third rail, but it turns out that it wasn't because the electricity jumped up the arc of the stream. It's because they were probably intoxicated and they fell onto the track and then they were electrocuted. At any rate, this idea of does ritual impurity travel up the stream when a pure vessel is pouring liquid into an impure vessel? And the answer is no, although we're going to see that there's an exception to that when the liquid that's being poured isn't actually liquid, but it's a very viscous, soft solid, right? And the example they will give of that is like a very thick honey. Then, the thick honey really does form a kind of bridge from the lower vessel to the upper vessel, and it would render the upper vessel impure if the lower vessel was found to be impure. So continuing this question, right? And we'll see why this is a related issue. We learned in a Mishna that anything that is poured remains ritually pure. In other words, if one pours liquid from one vessel into another, the stream of liquid is not considered to connect the two vessels. Consequently, if the upper vessel and its contents are pure, they do not become impure, even if the lower vessel into which the liquid that is poured is impure. So the stream of liquid does not link them in this manner. So the Mishnah adds, and this is the case for all liquids, except for zifim honey, which is a kind of thick honey, and batter. For example, flour mixed with honey, right? Like pancake batter. If you're like pouring that from one vessel to another, and it turned out that the lower vessel was impure, it would transmit its impurity to the upper vessel because it's such a thick form of substance that's being poured. Now, Beis Shammai say, Even the stream of a stew made of crushed and broken beans or of whole beans also connects two items because it returns backward. When one stops pouring this stew, part of the dish reverts to its place of origin, right? Like if it's a very thick substance you're pouring from one vessel to another, then you stop, some of the stuff that was, had come out will return because it's such a thick batter. So, Rami Bar Chama raises a dilemma, and we're in 50b. According to the opinion of the rabbis that in general poured liquid does not serve to connect, is there a stream for food or is there not a stream for food as opposed to liquid? If one pours melted food into an impure vessel, does the food which one is pouring become impure? Why are we talking about this? Because we're going to talk about how the status of liquefied solid, right, connects, that corpse flesh that liquefied, is it still that flesh or not? And also we ask the same question for the animal carcass. So here we're now bringing it around to saying that liquid does not connect two vessels, but like a honey, a very thick, solid that is kind of soft, does connect the two vessels. Okay, so what about kind of like mushy food? Like you, I don't know, like you put, you put something in a blender, right? And it was solid food, but it has now become liquid-like, right? It's not actually a liquid. You could start with, it's like you're making gazpacho, right? Like you put cucumbers and tomatoes and onions in a blender, and you come out with a mush, right? That's actually made of solid food. So if you're pouring that from one vessel to another, do we consider that the two vessels are linked and the impurity of the lower vessel would retract up to the upper vessel? Right? So is there a stream that links the two vessels for food, or is there not a stream for food? If one pours melted food into an impure vessel, does the food which one is pouring become impure? And the Gemara explains the two sides of the dilemma. Do we say that zifim, honey, and batter, which do connect the two vessels, make that connection because they have a flow that returns backward, and these regular foods do not have a flow that returns backwards? Or perhaps the reason why zifim, honey, and batter connect the two vessels is because they are viscous. And here the melted foodstuffs are also viscous. So Rava said, come in here a resolution from the Tosefta. If there was fat of a corpse that was whole and contained an olive bulk and one melted it, it is ritually impure, right? So melted flesh from a human corpse remains flesh from a corpse that imparts corpse impurity. If from the outset the fat was separated into pieces smaller than an olive bulk, which does not impart impurity, we saw that the minimum measure for a human, substance from a human corpse to impart impurity is the olive bulk. So what if we start with little pieces of fat that are smaller than an olive bulk? And then we melt it so that these several pieces, each of which is less than an olive bulk, now run together. So then, do those things combine to impart impurity? And this says, no, it is pure. And if it enters your mind that there is no stream for food, even if it was whole and one melted it, it should also be pure, as it became liquid and spread through the pan. Consequently, each part should be considered separate, which means the food is not the size of an olive bulk. So Rabbi Zera said, I and Mar, the son of Ravina, explained it like this. With what are we dealing here? With a case where, as he was heating it, the column of fire rose from under the pan to the mouth of the vessel, and the fat congealed there, so that it was all present together, i.e. there was no stream at all. And Ravina said to Rav Ashi, come and hear a resolution from the Mishna to the question of whether food is considered a stream or not. Beisham, I say, even the stream of a stew made of crushed and broken beans or whole beans does connect two items because it returns backward. And this indicates that the dispute in the Mishnah is whether or not stew meets the criteria of returning backward. And the rabbis hold that honey and anything like it, which return back into the pot, when you stop pouring it, some of it comes back into the pot, that this meets the criteria for connecting two vessels so that the impurity of the lower vessel could travel to the upper vessel. And Rav Ashi replied, are the cases comparable? There, in the case of honey, one might suggest it is a stream because it is viscous. Here, with regard to the stew, The reason Beis Shammai rules stringently is due to the flow, which runs backward, returns backward, but which does not create the same kind of viscosity that Zifim honey has. So the rabbis do not agree that this is a factor at all. And they leave it at that. So the Mishnah taught, what is the law for this stream? The stream of Zifim honey and batter connects two items, as these have drippings that stretch out like glue. Consequently, a stream of food does not connect the two vessels in this manner, even if it is viscous. So for example, beans or melted fat, because it is not held together with a flow of this kind, right? So even though you might take something solid and melt it, and when it pours, it looks like, thick honey when it's being poured. The fact is that the thick honey has an actual will make a bridge between the two vessels, that impurity can travel from one to the other. But something that was melted, that was a solid, or something that was mashed up, that was a solid, even though it seemingly pours, it's still actually made of smaller items, and the impurity will not travel up that stream. Now, the Mishnah taught, and for impurity imparted by a full ladle of dust. So we're back to our Mishnah, and what is it that imparts corpse impurity besides the whole body or an olive bulk of the flesh? Now we're learning that you also contract corpse impurity and need a 7-day purification if you come into contact with the dust of a corpse that's been desiccating for so long that it's turning into dust. So there you need more than an olive bulk of that dust. How much do you need? A ladle. And what is a ladle? When we first read that in the Mishnah, I said, I'm not sure what a ladle is. I'm thinking it's something like that. Well, let's see what the Gemara says. And how much is this measure of a full ladle of dust? Chizkiah said a full palm of the hand. So not 2 palms, 1 palm. A full palm of the hand. And Rabbi Yochanan said his handfuls, i.e. the amount that can be held in the whole hand, including the fingers. So Rabbi Yochanan is saying a full handful, and Chizkiah just said a palm, just what fits in the palm. So it's a much smaller measure than what fits like an actual cupped hand. Now the Gemara cites a relevant source. We learned in the Tosefta, the full ladle of dust that the sages spoke of includes all that can be contained from the base of the fingers and above. This is the measure, the statement of Rabbi Meir. And the rabbis say his handfuls, right? So the rabbis, the majority said like the full handful, palm, fingers, and everything. Now granted, Rabbi Yochanan spoke in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis. But in accordance with whose opinion did Chizkiah state his opinion, just the palm? His ruling is neither in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Meir, who said it was just the fingers, nor in accordance with the rabbis who say the whole hand. So the rabbis require his handful. Rabbi Meir refers only to the amount contained in the fingers themselves, while Chizkiah rules that it's the amount that can rest on the palm of a hand. And the sages say in response that Chizkiah's amount of a full palm of his hand and Rabbi Meir's measurement of the full amount of his finger joints from the palm of the hand and above are actually the same measure, right? So Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Chizkiah both say it's less will impart impurity. Their opinion is more stringent than the majority, but their opinion is the same, sort of like the amount of dust from a corpse, a desiccated corpse that could fit in the fingers is the same as what fits in the palm. But the actual amount that imparts corpse impurity is like the amount of dust in a whole handful. I'm almost done. If you got questions or comments, get them in. The Gemara raises a difficulty with regard to the basis of the question directed toward the opinion of Chizkiah. Rav Shimi bar Ada said to Rav Papa, from where do we know that this amount specified by Rabbi Meir from his finger joints and above means towards the end of his fingers? Perhaps it is only referring to below it, toward the arm, in which case it is exactly the same as Chizkiah's amount, a full palm of the hand. And if so, the Baraisa presents no difficulty to Chizkiah at all. And no answer was found, and the Gemara says that the question shall stand. What exactly did they mean? Was Chizkiah saying exactly the same thing as Rabbi Meir or not? We're not sure, but the majority ruled what is the minimum measure for imparting impurity from dust of a corpse? The full handful. Okay, let's go to questions or comments. Okay. And this is definitely one of those days where you see that the rabbis will not be shy about poking, as it were, into every area of human life to ascertain, what is the law, right? So we see that Torah law is not something that only applies when you're in synagogue or when you're sitting at your Shabbos table. It's like every area of life there is a right way and a wrong way to do it. And the rabbi said, well, since God gave a Torah that modulates and regulates sort of every aspect of life, okay, so we have to know what are the minimum measures or the minimum actions that will trigger a transgression. What are the limits of the law? And that's why they get into conversations like this. Not the most pleasant stuff to talk about, but when you think about the passion of the sages to say what is the truth and what is the law and how would it apply, we need to know. I mean, it's a really incredible search that the sages were on and that we remain on to know what is God's will in every area of our lives. Okay, Bill. Candidly, I grew up around cattle, and I assure you, a great number of boys have, over the years, tested that myth in the smaller form of an electric fence. Okay, and I would assume that nobody died from peeing on an electric fence. What is this question? So Joseph says, in regards to ritual impurity, we in the modern age tend to forget when reading biblical texts or other spiritual sources that the topic is not always scientific or literal, but allegorical, although sometimes we can go into the opposite extremes too. This is why I think tradition is so important. Those who have studied before us help us get into the ancient mind. Yeah, it's an interesting distinction. There's a wonderful quote. I'm sure I saw it somewhere attributed to Rambam, right, to Maimonides, who says that if you encounter, and Maimonides, one of the great minds of all Jewish history in terms of law and Torah interpretation, said that, and he was also a medical doctor. And so he said that if you encounter a conflict, a contradiction between science and Torah, it is because you are misunderstanding one or both of them, right? Both are true. I mean, first of all, science is not true. Science is a process, right? It's in quest of the truth. But the way that science works is that, we look at all the evidence and then we have a working theory of how something works, what it is, what it's made of, how we measure it. And then that is the working theory until we find evidence that, gives us a better understanding of that phenomenon. So it's like an evolving truth, as it were. Torah is an absolute truth, but sometimes it's difficult to understand exactly what the Torah is telling us. And that's why we have to look to our sages and to minds wiser than ourselves to understand exactly how this truth applies in the world. So the sages were always in a pursuit of truth. Now, sometimes, the conclusions that they came to do seem to contradict science. And I can't come up with an example right now, but it's interesting that, and if you read Jerry Schroeder's book, Genesis and the Big Bang, it's so interesting that, there were conclusions that the sages came to about astronomy, nearly 2,000 years ago that then, later minds said, oh, those guys had it totally wrong. And then science later still came around and said, oh, actually, they had it right. And it's an incredible thing. I remember Jerry pointing out that sort of like when God created the universe, somewhere in the Talmud it says that God's creation of the universe began with something the size of a mustard seed. And then, for centuries, scientifically minded people said, well, that's ridiculous. The sages had it all wrong. The universe is eternal. And then in modern times, here comes the Big Bang Theory, which is very consistent with that understanding. So, we just have to, but usually when we're talking about spiritual questions, right, then we're really asking, we're looking at two different realms. And then we should be very careful to say one realm contradicts the other when in fact the realms have nothing to do with each other, right? I mean, science looks to explain, how something comes into being. spirituality, right, and faith tradition helps us to understand why it came into being. Questions of how and questions of why are fundamentally different questions. That's what I've got for us today. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Wednesday, Yom Revi'i, the fourth day, at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a great night.